When I was a young boy, my father abandoned me. This is not a joke, this actually happened. Now that I am 26 and Arlecchino has taken me under her wing, I understand that my true purpose is to be a weapon. A weapon that will teach you all how to build your Arlecchinos, so that they can produce more weapons of mass destruction. Welcome to my father guide for the fatherless. Target demographic? The whole Genshin fanbase. Today, I'm gonna be going over what Arlecchino does, what her best artifacts are, and more. My name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Arlecchino. Despite it looking shorter than some of the newer kits in the game, it took me like 13 business days of reading to actually comprehend anything this character does. TikTok may have rotted my brain, but if nothing else, I can put stupid memes in my videos now. Oh, also, look at her charged attack. That's pretty cool, until you drown. Arlecchino plays with this mechanic called Bond of Life, which is a mechanic that you have to essentially out-heal to begin actually healing your character. But in Arlecchino's case, you can actually throw all of that out the window. It has been almost 5 years, and However still isn't beating the Nerf Bennett allegations. When Arlecchino has a Bond of Life above 30% and uses a charged attack, she gets a Pyro Infusion on her basic attack combo. Every time you hit an enemy with the Pyro Infusion, it deals high damage, scaling off of her attack and the Bond of Life that she has. And every time an attack connects, her Bond of Life decreases. Once it's below 30%, it falls off, much like my views. Much like a strict and unfeeling father, her damage is incredibly front-loaded. The longer she's on field, the lower her damage will become. But regardless, her damage is pretty solid. One thing to know about Bond of Life is that your full HP bar is actually worth 200% Bond of Life, not 100%. I'm not really sure why they have the full HP bar be 200%, but it is what it is. Basically, 30% is gonna look a lot smaller than it is, but I promise you it's above average, okay? It's not even that small. To get Bond of Life, you have to use her skill, which marks enemies hit with a blood debt because that's how Mafia works. Her skill generates 5 pyro energy particles, and the mark deals damage every 5 seconds up to 2 times. When you charge attack and enemies have a mark on them, Arlecchino absorbs the mark, which gives her a 65% Bond of Life for every enemy the mark is absorbed from, up to a max of covering her HP by 145%. So basically, you'll never max out Bond of Life to 200% from just her skill. With that said, one of her passives makes it so that after 5 seconds of a mark have passed on an enemy, she can actually gain 130% Bond of Life on that enemy instead of just a 65, meaning that you can almost completely max it out even in single target. That same passive gives Arlecchino a 130% Bond of Life upon defeating an enemy, meaning that the more small enemies she has to tear through, the more damage she'll deal overall due to higher Bond of Life. Remember, the higher Bond of Life you have, the more damage you do, and it just slowly decreases as your Bond of Life decreases. If you use her skill and then start an R&R world quest, chances are the skill won't be off cooldown by the time you're done. So we're pretty lucky that whenever she loses Bond of Life from attacking, her skill cooldown is reduced. Also, after using her burst, her skill cooldown gets reset, which brings us to her burst. I'm not sure the lore implications of this, but I'm fairly certain Arlecchino has glass bones and paper skin. If something so much as looks at her funny, she falls over and dies. But with her burst, she can heal a massive chunk of her HP. But unfortunately, they forgot to give her iframes. Her other passive gives her up to 20% resistance based on her attack, which is incredibly helpful for the 3 enemies in the game that don't one-shot you. And lastly, she gets 40% pyro damage, because okay, why not? If you passed out mid-explanation, then I suggest you go back to the beginning so I can farm ad revenue. But here's the main bit of what you need to know. I recommend playing Arlecchino with a rotation of EQE, or skill burst skill. Then rotate through your supports, then charge attack on Arlecchino to get her infusion. After that, you'll spam normal attacks until you're ready to rotate through supports again. The reason to play in this order is that her first skill can give energy and dish out damage, and then her burst can dish out even more damage and heal her. It also lets you funnel energy better. The second skill will mark enemies and allow Arlecchino to collect depths and get her Bond of Life and Pyro Infusion after she charged attacks, which is why you want to rotate through your supports first, because after using that second skill, by rotating through your supports, you're allowing 5 seconds to pass, which is going to increase the Bond of Life she gets from enemies from 65% to 130%. This is especially helpful in single target. Once you've rotated through your supports and that 5 seconds has passed, you go back to Arlecchino, use your charge attack, get the Pyro Infusion, and go ham. As for talent priority, I recommend leveling her basic attack as high as you can before anything else, since that's an overwhelming majority of her damage. And next up, let's talk about what mines you're going to be stuck in for the next 3 months. Yeah, I'ma be honest, guys, I've completely checked out on artifacts for this game, because once you've played for 4 years, you kind of just give anyone 2-piece damage bonus set and call it good. For Arlecchino, there's a few sets you have that can dish out solid damage. Her best in slot set is the new Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy set, which gives 18% attack for the 2-piece, and up to a 54% total damage bonus when Bond of Life increases or decreases. It stacks quickly with Arlecchino and makes it easily her best option. With that said though, if you don't want to be farming, forever, Gladiator's Finale is a set that most players will have after playing for a while. It gives a big damage bonus to normal attacks, which is a majority of Arlecchino's damage, and it also has an attack bonus on the 2-piece. If you have good stats on that set, it's really worth it for her. Other sets that work are Gilded Dreams and mixed pyro damage and attack percent sets. As for stats, I recommend going with attack percent Sands, pyro damage Goblet, and a crit rate or damage Circlet. You can also opt for Elemental Mastery Sands and double Hydro setups, but for more general, just gamers, I guess, attack percent Sands will be a little more consistent. As for energy recharge, I like to have around 120%, and most of the time my burst is ready each rotation. But for vape teams, or just depending on if you have Favonius users in your team, your ER requirements can increase or decrease, and I would say for vape specifically, you might have to go up to 140%. As usual, you want a 1-to-2 crit ratio of crit rate to crit damage. Here's a build summary for Arlecchino, and I wish you luck in the mines. The most hype thing for me about Arlecchino, aside from her Fate Heavensfield reference, is the fact that we finally have our first Scythe user in the game. Unfortunately, to get it, you're gonna have to pull on the weapon banner. Okay, Google, how do I escape student debt? Crimson Moon's Semblance is her best in slot for the Bond of Life and the other effects it gives, but also for the drip. It's an insanely cool weapon with a high power spike. With that said, she absolutely doesn't need it. There are decent 4-star options for her, and she can still pull pretty solid damage. But I, for one, will be pulling because it looks really cool, even though I'm really mad about it. The next best thing is going to be Jade Spear or Staff of the Scarlet Sands, depending on your team. Both give a ton of crit, which is really helpful for building your DPS. Dragon's Bane at high refinement is great in vaporized teams, and Deathmatch is a fantastic 4-star option for low spenders. For free-to-play players, if you can save up for a Black Cliff, it's pretty solid, and Prospector's Drill, Ballad of the Fjords, or is that Fords? To be honest, I don't really know. And White Tassel are also going to be decent. Here's some weapon comparisons just so you can get an idea of what to expect for Arlecchino. Keep in mind these comparisons aren't perfect and depend on your team composition and rotation, so your results could be different. As far as Arlecchino goes, she's actually your normal vaporized carry sometimes, but she has some other teams that work out very well in terms of overall damage and just having some different units to use from your normal pyro team setups. For example, some of her stronger teams actually use Overload. Now here's one example with Chevreuse, Bennett, and Fischl. And technically speaking, there's a lot of different characters that you can slot in here, but the main point is to have Arlecchino and Chevreuse. You could technically go with Yamiko instead of Bennett, and that's also fine. But the idea is obviously you want to use Overload reactions while also getting buffs from Chevreuse. And if you play Bennett, you can also get attack buffs too. But the nice thing is you don't actually have to do that. You don't have to play Circle Impact. If you want to play Yai Fischl, that's also fine. And the reason this actually works is because Arlecchino's range with her normal attacks is actually pretty high. With smaller enemies, at least, the ones that would get blown back by Overload and the ones that would fly away from you, she kind of like juggles them a little bit. She kind of picks them up, and because she's able to carry enemies like that, it makes it a lot easier for you to get away with playing Overload to get that extra AoE damage but still hit the enemies. Now there are a couple weird interactions, like I've seen instances where she'll literally just throw enemies behind you and then it's like hoy over, but for the most part this is actually a pretty fun team, and it finally gives you an excuse to play Overload outside of just over vape. Now, could you play over vape? The answer is yes, but then Chevreuse goes out the window and Bennett goes out the window. You could just play like double Hydro if you wanted to, or you could play one Hydro and a Flex character. Arlecchino's vaporized combos are not as straightforward as some of the other Pyro characters. I mean, she's gonna vaporize and deal high damage, and her normal attacks do enough damage to like make vaporize still very good, but it's not gonna be perfect combos like every other time. However, with that said, Arlecchino and double Hydro can be very strong, and I just put Kazuha in here as a flex. Obviously, if you can swirl either one of these elements, or both even preferably, you're gonna dish out a lot of damage. But one thing that I have not yet mentioned in the team section is that Arlecchino is actually incredibly squishy. So despite these teams being some of her best options for damage, with this one specifically shining in single target, because she can't actually gain any heals from Bennett, Chevreuse, or Xingqiu, she kind of just falls over and dies if you take one hit from an enemy. That's not an exaggeration at all. Some enemies will literally one-shot you. Now, I will say most enemies in the game probably aren't gonna one-shot you. She does have some resistances, and as long as you're above 75% HP, most you're probably taking to 60%, but some enemies will just absolutely decimate you, and that's not very fun. Even with the damage reduction from Xingqiu, I have been one-shot. So what I found to be most comfy, despite these teams being very strong, is playing Arlecchino with Zhongli. Many players have kind of put Zhongli on the backline just because there's so many great healers in the game, and you have some new shielders as well that can help with Dendro reactions. So many people have kind of just put him in the backline. There hasn't been a super big use case for him with a lot of the newer characters, and that's totally fine. The benefits that Zhongli brings you in this team, or in any one of these teams without Chevreuse, is that not only does he protect Arlecchino from getting one shot and help your combos not get interrupted, but he also lowers enemy resistances with his shield. So with that said, I actually really enjoy playing Zhongli, especially because I've been playing HSR so long that I kind of forgot how to dodge. But with that said, if you don't have skill issue, it's fine. You don't actually need them, and you can get more damage. The two characters I want to make note of that you probably don't want to play Arlecchino with, actually, this one isn't specifically a character. You probably want to dodge playing Arlecchino and Virgin. Because Arlecchino can only heal with herself, and therefore negates things like Bennett heals and Chevreuse heals. Any other healing that you would be normally getting from Virgin that would help you sustain yourself is kind of out the window. Arlecchino can heal herself to some extent, but if you're constantly taking chip damage from Virgin, that means that you are quite literally always in range of death, and it doesn't feel very effective, so personally, I would not play these two together. Or specifically a Virgin team. I just put Nahida here as an example. Now, the last character that I would avoid running with Arlecchino is actually Farina, and the reason for that is that unless you have C2 Farina, which basically increases your fanfare stacks that you get from her like drastically, the benefit you're going to get to Arlecchino actually isn't that high. Odds are Arlecchino's not going to be full HP all the time. She'll probably be sitting at around 80 or 70% after her heals, which ends up being fun most of the time. But for Farina, who actually gives your team bonuses based off of their HP draining, it basically puts Arlecchino always in death range, and she's only able to heal with herself, which means that a lot of the time, Farina's bonus won't actually be as useful as just running someone like Yelan, for example. That's not to say that your account explodes and people break down your door if you play these two together, but I personally wouldn't recommend it unless you have C2 Farina. Unlike my dad, I don't feel like Father is super restrictive. She has a lot of team comps she can play in. It's just that healing does end up getting a little less useful, and she's always in death range, it feels like. So characters like Zhongli, or even in Overload, if you wanted to play Thoma, would also be very good. And the very last note I want to make is that obviously, that banner made some suggestions. Rip Chevreuse Waters and hello Xiangling mates. Of everyone we've seen till now, Father is definitely one of the most anticipated arrivals. I would know, I've waited 26 years. With everyone being hyped for Arlecchino, I wanted to go over her constellations and what is and isn't worth it for spenders. First off, her Constellation 1 gives her a straight up 100% multiplier increase on her basic attack scaling whenever it's enhanced. To make sure there's no confusion on this, I'm talking about the multiplier increase she gets when she has her Pyro Infusion. Her Pyro Infused basic attack multiplier kinda works like Yunjin buff, so adding another 100% to it, it's pretty crazy. C1 also gives interrupt resistance, which means part of the reason to use a shield is also gone. Super good value for a C1. Constellation 2 deletes the 5-second rule from the game. Now, Arlecchino's marks instantly have the full effect after they're applied. Whenever she absorbs a mark, she procs her burst, which will dish out a ton of damage and give her a heal. The burst proc is 900% of her attack, but that attack multiplier also gets applied to her charged attack that procs the effect in the first place. I'm not really sure why it does that, if that's a media server issue or something, but we'll find out in like 20 minutes probably when someone wails. Her resistances also get an increase, and overall, the damage addition from C2 is pretty solid. C2 and C1 combined are gonna make it pretty easy to play her without a shield. Arlecchino's C3 is a normal attack increase. Thank God. C4 is a cooldown decrease and energy gain on Arlecchino's burst whenever you absorb her mark. It can only activate every 10 seconds, and overall, I don't think it changes much for her gameplay, but it technically lets you run no ER on her, which is good. C5 is a burst level increase, and C6 is a damage increase based on Arlecchino's burst. It basically gives her more Bond of Life damage scaling on her burst, which affects her normal usage and her C2 procs. C6 also gives her normal attacks and burst 10% crit rate and 70% crit damage, which is absolutely disgusting. From my experience, C0 Arlecchino is really solid with the right teams, and you don't need constellations at all. But for those of you with an extra kidney lying around to sell, her C6 is pretty crazy. Between her weapon and her C1, the choice is pretty obvious. Pick the scythe, it looks so fucking cool! The weapon banner is pretty bad in my opinion, just because of the 2 weapons and 75-25 combo. So if you have less pulls but want to go in on Arlecchino, it's probably safer to go for her constellations. Damage-wise, C1 and R1 are pretty comparable. Her weapon isn't super super useful on other characters compared to some of the other polearms, but her Constellations also can't be used on other characters because they belong to her, so you can either pick safety for your poles or you can pick drip. Let me know if father comes home in the comments, and I'll catch you next time.